The biggest media story in Canada. Let's talk residential schools. Why are we talking residential schools? We'll put some context to the next story, because the next story is talking about cultural attacks. This is all cultural attacks. Cultural because it is attacking the core culture, what makes Canada Canada, including our freedom of speech, including our freedom of expression, including the ability to hold a government accountable to some degree, to any degree at all. It attacks it all, right? And so understanding what happened in the 1960s and the 1970s is key to understanding what's happening now, okay? And here is Dean, and he says, the biggest media story in Canada for the past month is the residential school grave sites, yet not a single journalist has mentioned Pierre Trudeau or Jean Chrétien in their roles in the death of these Native kids. Now, you watch the show, so you know what I think about re-politicizing the deaths of these kids or people, whoever they are, whoever they were. It's not right. It's not correct. It's not a good thing to do. But what's really notable to me in the media is zero discussion of the name Trudeau, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who oversaw the last years of the residential schools, or I guess the beginning years of the government overseeing the residential schools from the Catholic Church, right? And Jean Chrétien, who they wrote an Indian white paper that was meant to remove the basically full integration of First Nations Canadians into regular Canadian culture. That was the idea. And the backlash was so great that they kind of like had to pull it in shame. But Pierre Elliott Trudeau, in his classic Trudeauism, insulted them at the end. Like, hold on, I'll find the quote. Okay, here's the quote attributed to Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Aftermath and significance. In response to the backlash, Prime Minister P.E. Trudeau withdrew the white paper in 1970 and angrily stated, quote, "We'll keep them," Indian First Nation people, "in the ghetto as long as they want. Indigenous activists and their allies continue to work on issues arising from this time period." So this is the context that the news media is just leaving out. Jean Chrétien's still alive, right? He was the minister at the time who co-authored the paper with Jean Chrétien. So you would think that they might have some insights into all of this, but nothing said in the media. That's the most notable part, right? Because the thing that it tells me is that the facts don't really matter. It's all about the narrative. It's all about what they're driving forward to make people believe and to get action out of people. This is interesting, and I've reported on this before, but I want to underline this. This has been announced again. I haven't reported on this specific announcement, but I've reported on other announcements of this sort. And it's important, again, in context, okay? Spencer Fernandez says, amid what is becoming an increasingly unhinged and emotionally manipulative narrative, it's important that we actually stick to the facts and reason. CBS News reports this, and I'll show you a CBC newspaper article that says the same, but Cowes First Nation Chief Cadmus Delorme, sorry, I forgot that wrong, said in a news conference last Thursday that the Catholic Church operated the school and its graveyard from 1886 to 1970 and removed headstones at the graves in the 1960s. He said a search of the grounds resulted in 751 hits, but the radar used as a 10 to 15% error rate. Quote, we cannot affirm, that they are children, he said. This is not a mass gravesite. They are unmarked graves. And this is the same here. So this isn't a matter of Canada dumping a bunch of kids into a big unmarked grave. This isn't a matter of Canada being disrespectful or anything to that effect. This was run by the Catholic Church. And there's a lot more context to this than anybody's wanting at all to discuss. And I'm going to give a bit more color in just a minute. But first, Saskatchewan First Nations announces 751 unmarked graves near former residential school. So the Maryville Indian residential school operated from 1899 to 1997 in the area where Cowes is now located. Is now located about 140 kilometers east of Regina. Children from First Nations in southeast Saskatchewan and southwestern Manitoba were sent to the school. The First Nation took over the school's cemetery from the Catholic Church in the 1970s. Cowes Chief Cadmus Delorme, sorry, all of those words are a little bit difficult, and so sorry if I stumbled on any of them, spoke at a virtual news conference on Thursday morning. This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves, Delorme said. Delorme said that they may have at one point been markers for the graves. He said the Roman Catholic Church, which oversaw the cemetery, may have removed the markers at some point in the 1960s. He said that it was not immediately clear if all of the unmarked graves belonged to children, but that there were oral stories within the community, Kalis First Nation, about both children and adults being buried there. He said some of the remains discovered may be people who attended the church or were from the nearby community. So this is, at least they're talking about the details here, because there's more to this than what the newspaper originally stated. And here is somebody and this is Twitter, so who knows, right? But this person says, she says, my mother went to a residential school and said that it was not as we are told. Many children came from homes who had no access to medicine, vaccines, and could not afford graves, thus the mass graves. She was able to get an education and battle TB. So there's more to these stories than what the media is lazily reporting to incite this violence, and it's very frustrating. Friends of Science goes further, and I thought this was worth talking about. Tuberculosis, TB, was the leading killer of all Canadians until 1960. Just as a quick aside, if you work with children, you have to have a skin TB test to this day. If you work in a daycare or a residential group home or a school board or anything to that effect. I don't know now if they do school boards. It's been a while since I started a new job in a school board, so I don't remember if I had to get a TB test to move school boards. But anyway, every other one up until at least 2011, I was getting skin TB tests. So just in case, just to be aware, you only need one as you start. You don't need one after if you've been working for 5 years, you never have to retest. But you are made to have these tuberculosis tests. Anyways, tuberculosis was the leading killer of all Canadians until the 1960s. First Nations more so due to living conditions and radical change in life. Tuberculosis victims were often buried in unmarked graves so the family would not be social outcasts. Right, because if people knew that you were exposed to tuberculosis because your brother had died or something to that effect, and they found your brother's name in the cemetery, maybe they come to your house and they want to make sure that nobody, right? Like have you seen the mass Karens, right? Like maybe that's a modern version of something that would not be so good, right? So interesting, very interesting context, and I think that bears talking about, that is ignored. Carrying on, tuberculosis is still a killer for Aboriginal people. How does lowering flags help the living and suffering? Why not do something real to help these people? Yeah, all of this nonsense, all of this rhetoric, all of this pumping up of people's what about me? What about me? I don't know what the term is. Victim mentality, victimhood. I don't know, victim mentality is fine, has resulted in people lashing out at statues. It's very interesting. Here is CBC News encouraging people to have a Cancel Canada Day rally. So just a quick aside, yesterday in Guelph, I saw a hashtag Cancel Canada Day, and they were doing a Cancel Canada Day rally. And apparently we can't have fireworks in the park, right? We used to have Rotary would do fireworks in the park for Canada Day. And so we can't have fireworks in the park, but we are allowed to have a big mass march to cancel Canada Day because of residential schools. Do you see the problem? So that's why we started with the residential schools, and we're going to get into this. But Ryan O'Connor says, CBC says crowds protesting Canada's handling of the fallout of the residential schools graves pulls down statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II in front of the Manitoba Legislature building. And Ryan O'Connor says, if this was an anti-lockdown demonstration, the headline would read, unmasked anti-public health protesters march illegally violating orders against mass gatherings. Forget about the statues, right? The statues are, that's part of most takeovers that I've seen. Like, they burn libraries, they burn books, they take out the history, and then they say, well, we've always been at war with fill in the blank, right? Read 1984. Here is somebody pointing out, hey Brian Pallister and Mayor Bowman, if you're going to let people destroy public property to change the political system, it seems it was state sanctioned at this point. And then he talks about that illegal drug that you're not allowed to talk about on social media, otherwise your channel gets turned off. Breaking, statue of Queen Victoria has been torn down in front of Manitoba legislature. Statue is covered in red paint handprints. Right? These people are heroes. Right? They think they're heroes. They think that they're doing something good, but they've just been manipulated by a false narrative put out by the media, inciting violence against Canada's core culture, against Canada's basic rule of law. If you tear it all down, do you really believe you can put it back better than it was? You better be sure. You better be sure, because once it's torn down, it's very difficult to put back the way it was. Right? Queen Victoria statue in Winnipeg. This is the state legislature building and not a policeman in sight. Right? They were tearing this down. It was allowed to happen. Statue of Queen Elizabeth II adjacent to the government house has also been brought down. Here is Jason Kenney. The vandalism of churches across Alberta is appalling. This happened today at an African evangelical church in Calgary. The congregation is made up entirely of new Canadians, many of who came here as refugees fleeing countries where churches are often vandalized and burned down. These folks came to Canada with the hope that they could practice their faith peacefully. Some of them are traumatized by such attacks. This is where hatred based on collective guilt for historic injustice leads us. Let's seek unity, respect, and reconciliation instead. They've got the genie out of the bottle, and now that they're trying to put the cork back on and hope the genie goes back in, they're fool. And then none of them want to solve the core problems. They've vilified the police to the point of, if you want to be a police officer, I have to question your sanity. They have they have created a situation where people on police forces are leaving, and this is in the States, but because other people are being charged for assault or being put in jail for 20 years of murder for murdering somebody by following their training. You can't train somebody to do something and then charge them for murder when they do it, right? Like, in my opinion, anyway. And so it's a very kind of fraught situation to foster the taking down of statues, to ignore the burning of churches for like a week, and then now get upset about it? Like, guys, you did this. You incited this. You said, oh, we're so terrible. Us Canadians are awful people, and we're so terrible, and this and that. But it's not true. It's just the rhetoric. Just in the same way that mask work isn't true. It's just the rhetoric, right? And I can say that it's objectively not true because we have multiple court cases upheld by multiple courts before the madness of 2019 struck that say masks don't work, right? It's just rhetoric. It's just ridiculous rhetoric. It's getting so bad in Canada that BBC has even picked up the story. 10 churches vandalized in Alberta on Canada Day. That's not even Canada-wide. Incredible what's going on in our country. Here is Candace Malcolm. 2013, Justin Trudeau says Canada is the best country in the world. 2021, Trudeau says Canada is one of the best countries in the world. What happened? What changed? Oh, I can tell you what changed. Justin Trudeau was in charge for 6 years and he destroyed the place. That's what's changed. That's the simple truth of it all. And the reality is, like, when you compare and you look at what's been happening with regards to the residential schools and the attack on Canadians that way, and the sorry, I just try to fix things. The residential schools and the attack on Canadians that way, and when you look at the cultural attacks in a broader sense, the statues coming down, et cetera, yeah, it's remarkably worse than under Harper. People would never do that under Harper because the police would enforce, like, you can't vandalize this property. This has been paid for by taxpayers. What the heck is wrong with you? Right? And that's wild. That's wild. And now Trudeau is trying to tell us to be honest. National News Watch is reporting Trudeau tells Canadians to be honest about our past in Canada Day statement. Yeah. See, I think people are just, well, maybe people aren't tuning them out. I mean, they are tearing down statues after all, right? And that's not good. That's a certain departure from what we like and the whole rule of law, etc. in this country, and why under Justin Trudeau it's gotten worse, much worse.